interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
So besides being unprepared militarily, the other question is, what about the medical department of the Army? How ready are they? Totally unprepared. They've got 5 general hospitals in the entire United States. 5. No mobile field hospitals anywhere.
But I was up in the air, and then I heard of a concussion, a big, loud bomb. You know, I thought the ground opened up underneath me. But I was actually hit with an 88, and it blew me about 15 feet in the air and about 30 feet away. And when I landed, I thought, well, I've had it, you know, but I didn't know where I was hit.
I didn't even know the crew I was with. I got on the flight line. I said, where are we going? They said, oh, it's a milk run, easy mission. We're just going to fly over Toulon and go after these gun emplacements. These guys didn't know what they were talking about. These are 88 millimeter stuff. I knew that. So I get in the plane, I'm up at the top turret, and we make landfall. Just at that point, 88 millimeter knocks the right engine right off the wing. So I had to bail out. I bailed out. It's over Toulon. And I landed in a deep gorge on the in the Maritime Alps, where I broke my leg when I hit the ground, and I had a wounded arm. Right arm was flak.
We were getting ready to move out, and that's when I got hit. And believe it or not, I was one of the few that was hit by friendly fire. Well, as it happened, I don't know whether I was lucky or unlucky, but anyway, that was really all of the war that I really saw. The bullet went through my leg, but the medic only noticed the wound on the one side. As a result, I went to the battalion aid station and then the larger hospital. By the time I got to England, the leg was infected.
The construction of Crile was going to be an economic boom for the whole area. Of course, it was surveyed, and construction began in March 1943. Of course, there are some limits. It's going to be built of wood and brick, very little steel, because obviously it's a critical metal. So the Army Corps of Engineers were the prime contractors, and then they went to the various private construction companies in Cleveland to do some of the finishing work, the masonry work, and all the other construction. And of course, it provided tremendous opportunities for jobs, and even teenagers who needed summer jobs, of course, could come out to this site and finish the construction of the hospital.
Our first day on the job was interesting, even though there was gas rationing. My dad scooped up enough to take us out and, to the job site, which was a barracks.
Wooden barracks that were temporary as offices for the employees during the construction period of the hospital. We rode our bikes out Pearl Road to York Road. York Road was a very narrow 2-lane road at that time. And basically the whole area had been farmland, as I would recall, and not many trees around really, but they were just beginning to get things organized to start the construction. The only buildings there were those barracks-like buildings for offices.
The job was a surveyor's assistant, which was mostly labor work. Carry the transit, carry the rod, carry the measuring, what do they call it, Herman? Line?
Line.
Line. the sledgehammer, the stakes, the tacks, and lug this around under the supervision of the War Department surveyors. The job was interesting. The engineers were a bunch of nice guys, but we did know it was Crile being built as Crile Hospital, and it really was built by kids, old men, and 4Fs.
Crile Hospital is named, of course, for General George Washington Crile, a pioneer in military medicine, born in Ohio in the 19th century, and absolutely brilliant in his early research in shock, blood transfusions, blood pressure. He served in the Spanish-American War, took the Lakeside Unit here in Cleveland, Unit number 4, to France in 1915 before the United States entered the war. And then when the United States did enter the war in 1917, he and his colleagues were there to service the needs of the wounded Americans and the British and the French and all the other services. He then came back with his cousin, Ed Lauer, who also was with him in France, and Dr. Bunce and Dr. Phillips. And the four of those physicians then, because of their team approach in the field hospital in France, realized that that was the way to maximize the efficiency of surgical technique through a team. So in 1921, the four established the Cleveland Clinic Foundation. Crile was dedicated in an open house on Easter Sunday, 1944, and the Surgeon General, Norman Kirk, was here to officiate at these ceremonies. The widow of George Crile was here, Grace Crile, and believe it or not, 100,000 people showed up to see the Crile Hospital. And from that time on, of course, it was a teeming center of activity, many out-of-state visitors coming to see relatives. And you can imagine that the patient population would get way over 2,000. In fact, they peaked in 1945 at over 3,000 patients. And of course, they ran out of beds, which meant they had to rent space in Cleveland hotels. So Crile was a real mecca for the veterans returning from both theaters, the Pacific and the European, for rehabilitation.
When I went into the hospital with Colonel Knight and Colonel Harding, shook hands with Colonel Harding. He said he had to go check something, inspect something, and he said, I'm not going to say enjoy your stay because I know you're going to have many operations, stuff like that. And he said, but I hope we can make you as comfortable as you can be, if I remember right. And then Major Knight got a wheelchair for me. And I said, I can walk. He said, no, it's a long way. He says, I'm taking down to the orthopedic ward, and we'll get some paperwork done on you. And he wheeled me, and then the nurses came out there, about 5 or 6 nurses. He introduced me to all the nurses. He said, these nurses are going to take care of you. He said, of course, later on, they'll all have different jobs, different wards to take care of. He said, but right now, since you're the only one, you are going to be treated like a king.
I was flown off the beach and back to over to Italy, 18th General Hospital, and then fly on a C-57 or whatever it was, C-54 carrier ship with stretchers, flown back to the United States to Coral Gables, Florida, where I went to Coral Gables and I stayed there 2 days, and this Alabaman officer came into my room and he said, you know, because of the fact that you had been a prisoner, you're entitled to go to any hospital in the United States as long as they're equipped to take care of orthopedic work. So I said, well, I'd like to go to near Cleveland, Ohio, because that's my hometown. But I said, I don't know if they have an Army hospital there. He said, well, he said, I'll tell you what we've got. He says, let me look at my roster. So he looks, he says, Ohio. He said, we don't have anything in Cleveland, but we got a hospital in Parma. I said, well, how do you spell Parma? He said, P-A-R-M-A. I said, that's good.
One of the more interesting and least known aspects of Crile Hospital in its operation was the fact that between 200 and 300 German POWs were right here at Crile General, less than 300 yards from a suburban street. And in fact, when you start adding this up about German POWs, why are German POWs at Crile? Why are German POWs in Ohio? Well, as more and more prisoners are being taken, what better place than to get rid of them by taking them back to the United States where they can be employed and be out of the way of the Allied GIs, the Allied troops.
But that batch that we had then were desert fighters, and they were pretty mean. And one of the guards on duty at that time, they were fixing the street, doing some repair work on one of the streets out there, and German guard, one of the German prisoners, went after the guy with the shovel for some reason or other. I don't know what it was. The guy told him, to drop it, and he wouldn't stop, he wouldn't drop it, so the guy shot him. And he wasn't killed at that moment. He died later on. But anyway, they brought him in, and he was in the next room to me on Ward 23, Ward 23A. I was in a private room, and he was in the next room.
I must have been about 10 years old, perhaps 11, and I remember that we had a relative who was badly burned at Crile, and we went over to visit him, and my brother and I, my big brother, came along for the ride because we didn't get that many rides in the days of gas rationing. And this had been just about my first trip onto the west side. We didn't stay too long with our relative because we were, I guess, a little too rambunctious. So they sent us out into the gardens. Must have been springtime because everything was in bloom and very green, I remember. And while we were walking around admiring it, we noticed all these groundskeepers with these gray uniforms with PW on the back. And it slowly occurred to us that these were prisoners of war. We asked about them and were told offhandedly that they were all Germans. What I remember is that they were very big, and they were very sullen. And they were like the Nazis of the movies, of my nightmares. And they left an indelible impression.
Crile General Hospital was a city unto itself. The nurses, the doctors, of course, lived on base. You had hundreds of civilian employees that lived off base. You had a swimming pool, you had a complete recreational area, a theater, a library. The Cleveland Public Library brought out books. The Cleveland Press, under the leadership of Louis B. Seltzer, made sure that every GI had his own radio because the hospital had its own radio station. So every GI had what today we would call almost a headset, 3 stations, the radio station at the hospital, and then it would pick up 2 other stations from Cleveland. So the community really took Crile and its patients into its heart, into its family, so to speak.
Colonel Hardin wanted everybody to get out on the weekends, have a good time. He's saying, you go into Cleveland and you didn't have to carry any money with you because if you started out with $2, you were going to come back with $2. Some guy said to me one time, he was new to Cleveland area, new to Crile, and he said, well, he said, you live here. He said, tell me some of the cheap beer joints, he said, because where you can get 10-cent beer and stuff like that. I said, you don't do it that way. You got $2, you go into the best bar in town, you go down to Euclid Avenue, Playhouse Square, go to the best bar in town, put the $2 on the bar and say, that's it, I might as well shoot this $2. Give me one of that top shelf whiskey. You're gonna go out of there drunk and you're gonna have $2 in your pocket.
Crile's specialty was orthopedic surgery, burns, and later neuropsychiatric.
It was in the fall. I know it's shortly before Christmas, and I had to have some nerve. I had what they call a radial nerve paralysis, and where you have a dropped wrist, and they had saved the arm. They gave me bone grafts and everything else. They had about 48 operations while I was there, maybe more. But I couldn't move my fingers or anything. So they sent me down to Nichols Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, which was similar to Crile, but not as pretty as Crile.
Early on, before I did anesthesia there, I worked on the wards when it was necessary, and I became friends with this boy. And he used to save his mail for me to read to him and ask me to write to his girlfriend. And and then I did not see him because I moved to surgery, but I would go to see him every day. And they came and got me in the middle of the night he died, because he was asking for me. And I wrote a letter to his parents, which is not permitted in the Army. And I knew that, but I wrote the letter and gave it to our commanding officer, and he sent it to them after they had been officially notified that their son had died. And I just never forgot that boy.
When, at last, VE Day in May and then VJ Day in September 1945, the guns were silent and everybody's, of course, desperate to get home, what do you do with all of these hospitals? I mean, they were tremendously important while the casualty figures are continuing to mount. So the war is over in 1945. What now? Many of the general hospitals were closed. Crile, however, was designated in June of 1946 to the new Veterans Affairs or Veterans Administration Division. So in 1946, Crile General became Crile VA Hospital. The mission of Crile VA in 1946 was slightly altered. It involved much more teaching, a reduced patient population, an expanded role for women, minorities, and patient services. And from that point on, Crile VA and the rest of the VA hospitals continued to do their service, because the wounds of World War II, of course, would continue literally in many cases for years, long after 1945.
I knew we were going to move to Cleveland. And I wrote to VA Hospital in Cleveland asking for an interview. My first tour of duty was on spinal cord injury, and we had 40 patients. The nurses were very receptive. I was just one of them, as usual, because I think nurses have a special bond. My head nurse was Jean Hickey. And so I didn't have any untoward effects. It was just another job that I enjoyed. I liked nursing, so it was not difficult for me.
Almost as suddenly, but not as shocking as Pearl Harbor, we heard in June of 1950 that North Korea has crossed the 38th parallel and attacked South Korea. I'm not sure how many Americans knew where Korea was, but certainly phrases like the 38th parallel and all of the other associations with the Korean War began to really dominate our news in the summer of 1950. So here again, Crile VA will become a serviceable hospital as more and more GIs are returning from the Korean War, in which over 50,000 died, and thousands, of course, sustaining wounds that needed treatment, and in this case, back at Crile VA.
It was the beginning of the evacuation from the fields. During World War II, we developed close air support where you could help the troops on it. Now this was the other part. The helicopters came aboard, where a person could be transferred to a helicopter, airlifted to a field hospital or to a Navy hospital ship and be treated. This was a great savings for those who had. Later on, we had the opportunity to have airstrips where we could fly people out, and that made a big difference. I would say that a great number of people were wounded, but because of the improved supply, people survived. People that would normally die because they couldn't be treated fast enough.
Crile is a hospital treating patients, but there's another dimension that I think we tend to miss. There are families, mothers, fathers, parents, children, doctors, nurses, living as best they can as a family on the base, both during World War II and during the 1950s when it was a VA hospital.
Well, I don't think I really have an earliest recollection. That year at Crile just sort of all blends together. But I recall it being extremely pleasant. From an adult's point of view, I think I grew up in with the facilities of a health spa. I don't think back in the early 50s many kids had the opportunity to have swimming pool available to them and a gymnasium available. As I recall, the hospital was surrounded by a very, very large wooded area. I remember as a kid believing, I think there was a drainage ditch that ran across the place that at the time I thought was probably a wonderful trout stream. So it was just a very, very pleasant time.
I think I started there about 1956 when I was 12 years old, and continued on probably till the early 1960s. It was very interesting work in the sense that as a 12-year-old boy, you saw throughout that hospital the results of these veterans, many of them young men in their early 30s from World War II, who were still hospitalized with just horrifying injuries. And part of our duties as altar boys was, or included going around to the wards before Mass and finding the veterans who wanted to attend Mass and wheeling them to the chapel in wheelchairs or sometimes on gurneys. There were men with missing limbs, burns, just terrible injuries.
When the Korean War ended in 1953 as a truce, stalemate, that didn't mean that the Cold War was over. In fact, you could argue the Cold War was still as hot as ever, with all of the issues of fallout shelters and nuclear testing and the activities of Senator McCarthy and all the others. In fact, civil defense and almost a paranoid fear of a Russian communist attack began to infect our attitudes. The response at Crile was extremely interesting.
Sometime in 1956 or 1957 when a Nike missile site was built there. The entire project, as I recall it, was completed in 3 or 4 months. And I remember headlines in the Cleveland Press and Cleveland Plain Dealer and Cleveland News about the Russian bomber threat, and the fear was that they would come in, I think, over the Arctic and over Canada, and Cleveland was a prime industrial target. And so these air defense missile sites were installed around Cleveland, and one was installed at Crile Hospital.
By 1964, Crile has pretty much outlived its usefulness to the veterans community because Wade Park had begun construction and Crile closed in 1964. So in that period from 1964 to 1966, discussion was centering around what it should be, and then in September of 1966, in the same barracks built back in 1944, Crile went through a third generation as the western campus of Cuyahoga Community College.
I started my life at Cuyahoga Community College, faculty member in fall of 1965. Brownell Building housed the science department in Metro Campus. Soon after arriving there, I was told a new campus was to open. Lo and behold, it was going to be in my own city of residence, Parma, Ohio. But yet I hadn't seen the campus. I'd never been out here.
The 35 or so faculty that were in that first wave, class of 1966, I think generated a real sense of camaraderie, kind of pioneers literally in the Crile days. But then in 1974-75, all that was raised, and the new facility that we now know as the Western Campus at 11,000 Pleasant Valley Road is obviously a testimony to the continuing support of the community.
We all run into people who say, yes, I got my start at Cuyahoga Community College, or I got my start, in this case, at the Western campus. So I think, and I'm probably biased, it's been a great investment for the community, and the community has embraced this college with many forms of support. And we like to go back and look at an early motto, from healing to learning. And even in that learning, our health career programs continue the tradition of healing.
Going home, going home, I'm a-going home, quiet like some still day, I'm just going home. It's not far, just close by, through an open door. Work all done, care laid by, going to fear no more. Mother's there, expecting me, Father's waiting too. Lots of folk gathered there, all the friends I knew.
This memorial is dedicated to all veterans. It is fitting it be on this site, first home to Crile Veterans Hospital, built to heal the wounded, and now part of Cuyahoga Community College. This monument serves as a perpetual memorial to all the men and women who answered the call. We embrace their spirit while holding them in our hearts forever.